You fired who? The CEO's voice changed into full of disbelief. A relatively professional engineer turned into allowed to move, but 2 weeks later, his former boss came back begging him to go back. What happened? What did he do that turned the whole company the wrong way up? Daniel Carter had given 30 years of his life to Rockwell Motors. A master mechanic, he had built a reputation as the person who could diagnose an engine's trouble simply by listening to it run. His hands, calloused from a long time of work, had saved thousands of cars from being scrapped. Customers didn't just come to Rockwell Motors for repairs, they came for Daniel. But to Mark Rockwell, the new proprietor, Daniel was nothing more than an aging worker slowing down operations. The day Mark fired him, the shop felt less warm than typical. Daniel had been underneath a truck, tightening a bolt, when Mark's sharp voice cut through the air. Daniel, we need to talk. Wiping grease from his hands, Daniel stood, his gut already telling him this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. Mark held a clipboard, eyes scanning over numbers, not looking Daniel in the face. Your repair times are slower than the younger guys. We need efficiency, not nostalgia. It's time for you to go. The words hit harder than Daniel expected. He had been here longer than most of the equipment in the shop. He had trained half the mechanics working there. But Mark wasn't interested in history. Daniel swallowed hard, nodded once, and turned away. If there was one thing he had learned in 3 decades of fixing engines, it was to leave a broken machine before it dragged you down with it. Packing up his toolbox was the hardest part. His workspace was full of stickers from car shows, faded pictures of him with John Rockwell, the man who had given him his first real job. Daniel had started at Rockwell Motors as a child with nowhere to go, sweeping floors, learning through watching, earning his place one wrench turn at a time. John had treated him like family, taught him not just how to repair cars, but how to take pride in his work. And now his son was throwing him away like an old part. Word spread quickly. By the time Daniel had carried his last box to his truck, half of the city knew. Customers who had relied on only him for their classic restorations were livid. The local car enthusiast club, a group of long-time clients, immediately pulled their business. Mechanics he had trained watched in silent anger as their mentor walked out for the last time. But Mark didn't care. He had a new vision for Rockwell Motors: quicker turnaround, lower costs, greater profits. What he failed to understand was that a shop was more than just numbers, it was trust, and trust wasn't something that could be bought. Daniel sat in his truck outside the shop for a long moment, looking at the building that had been his home for 30 years. The familiar heady scent of motor oil and steel clung to his clothes. He had sacrificed weekends, late nights, time with his own family for this place, and now it was gone. A deep breath, the engine roared to life. Without looking back, he pulled away from Rockwell Motors, the only job he had ever known. He didn't realize that weeks later, that same shop would be on the verge of collapse. And when Mark came knocking on his door, begging him to come back, Daniel would have a choice to make, one that would change everything. Mark Rockwell had a plan. The day he took over his father's shop, he saw Rockwell Motors not as a place built on loyalty and craftsmanship, but as a business with outdated techniques. In his eyes, performance was king. If cutting repair times by 30% meant better profits, then that was the future. And if that meant letting go of old habits and old mechanics, so be it. The changes came suddenly. Digital timers were installed in every bay, monitoring how long each process took. Mechanics were given quotas, 5 repairs per day minimum. Quality inspections, once the hallmark of Rockwell Motors, were now deemed optional, something to be done only if there was extra time. Daniel saw it all happening in real time. The younger mechanics, keen to impress, followed orders without question, moving from one job to the next like an assembly line. But they didn't realize what to look for, the small signs of trouble that came with experience. The sound of a timing belt just slightly off, the faint heady scent of burning oil that signaled an issue beyond the plain repair. Daniel had spent many years catching those mistakes before they became costly. Now those details were disregarded in favor of speed. One afternoon, he watched as a 19-year-old technician, barely a year out of trade school, struggled with a transmission rebuild. The kid was rushing, sweat beading at his temples as he fought to finish in time. Daniel stepped in, ready to offer guidance, but before he could say a word, Mark's voice cut across the shop floor. Daniel, let him work. Don't have time for lectures. Daniel turned to face him, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. It's not a lecture. He's about to miss a seal that's going to cause a leak within a week. Mark folded his arms. Then he'll fix it when it comes back. More repairs, more money. Daniel stared at him, taken aback. That's not how we do things. This is how we do them now. Mark's voice was firm, his expression unreadable. This isn't a school, Daniel. It's a business. Daniel shook his head. A bad repair isn't just a mistake, Mark. It's a liability. You send someone out in a faulty car, and they might end up in a wreck. We're not just fixing machines, we're responsible for the people driving them. Mark's jaw tensed. And I'm responsible for keeping this shop running. We can't afford to waste time on overcomplicated repairs. If you can't keep up with the way things are now, maybe you don't belong here anymore. Silence spread across the shop floor. The younger mechanics, sensing something bigger than an argument, paused their work. Even the office staff in the front glanced toward the garage, their conversations quieting. Daniel took a breath, forcing his voice to stay steady. John Rockwell built this place on trust. Customers came here because they knew we wouldn't cut corners. You throw that away, and you're not running Rockwell Motors, you're running a factory. Mark's face hardened. That's enough. Pack up your things, Daniel. You're done here. For the first time in his life, Daniel found himself frozen, uncertain of how to respond. He had been here longer than most of the equipment in the shop. He had trained half the men standing around them. His fingerprints were on every inch of this place. But Mark was the boss now. Daniel exhaled slowly, glancing around one last time at the shop that had been his home for 30 years. Then, without another word, he walked to his station, grabbed his toolbox, and started packing. The shop remained eerily silent as he worked. No one moved, no one spoke. Even Mark, standing rigid by the office door, didn't say anything more. The sound of tools clinking against steel was the only noise that filled the room. By the time Daniel lifted his box and walked toward the exit, some of the younger mechanics lowered their heads, ashamed. Others, the ones he had trained personally, looked on in quiet anger. They wanted to speak, to argue, to protest, but they knew it wouldn't change anything. At the door, Daniel paused. He turned, his gaze landing on Mark one last time. You think speed is more important than trust. One day, you'll realize you were wrong. Mark didn't flinch. We'll see. Without another word, Daniel stepped out into the afternoon sun, the heavy shop door swinging shut behind him. Word spread quickly. By the end of the day, the local car enthusiast club, men who had relied on only Daniel for their prize restorations, pulled their business. Customers who had been coming to Rockwell Motors for years called, demanding to know if the rumors were true. Some of the younger mechanics, those who had respected Daniel, considered leaving, but they needed the paychecks too much. Mark told himself it didn't matter. One man couldn't make or break a business. He had a vision, and nothing, not even Daniel Carter, was going to stop him. But Mark underestimated one thing. Trust wasn't just built on a name, it was built on the people behind it. And without Daniel, Rockwell Motors was about to learn just how fragile that trust really was. 2 days after Daniel Carter walked out of Rockwell Motors, the first signs of trouble began to show. A customer brought in his Dodge Charger for what should have been a routine brake pad replacement. The job was assigned to one of the new mechanics, eager to prove himself under Mark's new system. He worked fast, hit his quota for the day, and the car was sent back to its owner. The next morning, the Charger was towed back into the shop. Its brakes had failed on the highway. The customer stormed through the front doors, red-faced and shaking with rage. "You people almost got me killed," he shouted. Mark smoothed things over with a free repair, but it was only the beginning. By the end of the week, complaints started piling up. A Honda Accord came back twice in 3 days for the same transmission issue. A BMW that had been serviced on Monday was back on Friday with engine trouble that hadn't existed before. The phone rang constantly, angry customers demanding explanations, refunds, or both. Without Daniel's steady hand overseeing quality, small mistakes were becoming big ones, and big mistakes were becoming lawsuits waiting to happen. Inside the shop, morale had plummeted. The younger mechanics, once enthusiastic about their newfound freedom, were now overwhelmed. They didn't have time to double-check their work, let alone learn from their mistakes. Every time a car came back with an issue, Mark pushed harder, less talking, more fixing. The pressure built until one of the senior mechanics, Luis, finally had enough. One night after closing, he walked into Mark's office and dropped a stack of work orders onto his desk. "This isn't working," he said flatly. "We're cutting corners, and we all know it. Customers aren't coming back. We lost 3 fleet accounts this week. Some of the guys are talking about leaving." Mark barely looked up from his computer. "We'll find new customers. And if anyone wants to leave, they can." Luis narrowed his eyes. "Is that what you told Daniel? That he was replaceable?" Mark's jaw tensed, but he didn't answer. Luis let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you? People didn't come here because of the name on the building. They came because they trusted Daniel. Because they knew he wouldn't let them drive off in a car that wasn't 100% safe. And now we've got cars breaking down 2 days after they leave the shop. How long do you think this place can survive like that?" Mark finally looked up. "You done?" Luis studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I'm done." He pulled off his work shirt and tossed it onto the chair. "I quit." Mark scoffed. "You really think walking out is going to change anything?" Luis gave him a knowing smirk. "No. But I think you're about to find out just how much damage you've done." The next morning, Mark arrived at the shop to find 2 more resignations sitting on his desk. By the end of the day, a 3rd mechanic had walked. That same afternoon, an email hit Mark's inbox from one of their biggest corporate clients, an auto rental company that had been using Rockwell Motors for fleet maintenance for over a decade. Effective immediately, all future repairs will be outsourced elsewhere. Mark felt his stomach drop. He stood from his desk and looked out at the shop floor, where there had once been a full team. Now, only a handful of mechanics remained, scrambling to keep up with the growing backlog of work. The air was thick with tension. Customers were calling non-stop, demanding explanations for shoddy repairs. The front desk manager, who had been there since Mark was a kid, wouldn't even look him in the eye. This wasn't just a rough patch, it was a disaster. That night, Mark sat alone in his father's old office, staring at the framed photos on the wall. Pictures of his dad shaking hands with customers, standing beside Daniel at car shows, posing in front of the shop's grand opening decades ago. His father had built this place on trust, and Mark had thrown it away in less than a month. He reached for his phone, hesitated, then finally pulled up Daniel's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. Mark exhaled sharply and dropped the phone onto his desk. Daniel wasn't going to come back on a phone call. If he wanted to fix this mess, he was going to have to face him in person. And he had no idea if Daniel would even listen. The sleek black Bentley pulled into the lot of Elite Auto, its polished exterior reflecting the morning sun. Mark Rockwell gripped the steering wheel tightly, watching the pristine garage ahead of him. The logo above the entrance gleamed in bold silver letters, a symbol of precision, detail, and everything Rockwell Motors used to stand for. Through the open bay doors, he saw Daniel Carter. He was crouched under the hood of a classic Corvette, his hands working methodically, effortlessly. He looked completely at home, like he had been here forever. Mark hesitated, his hands tightening on the leather-wrapped steering wheel. This was the last place he wanted to be. His pride screamed at him to turn around, but pride wouldn't fix Rockwell Motors. Taking a deep breath, he opened the car door and stepped out. A few heads turned. A couple of mechanics exchanged glances, murmuring. Daniel didn't notice at first. He was focused, listening to the engine purr as he adjusted a component. Then one of the younger techs nudged him, motioning toward the well-dressed man standing at the edge of the garage. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and finally looked up. His expression barely changed, no surprise, no anger, just calm, unreadable. Mark swallowed hard, stepping forward. Daniel. A long pause. Daniel gave a slow nod. Mark. Silence stretched between them. The hum of power tools filled the air, the faint scent of oil and grease thickening the garage. Mark shifted his weight. I need to talk. Daniel didn't move. I figured. Another pause. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, Daniel stepped away from the car, motioning toward the side of the building. Come on. Mark followed, his dress shoes clicking against the concrete floor, painfully out of place in a space where steel-toed boots reigned. Daniel led him to a quieter corner near the back, away from prying ears. Mark exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. The shop's falling apart. Daniel crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. I know. Mark blinked. You do? Daniel gave a small shrug. Word gets around. Mark hesitated, glancing away. I made a mistake. The words tasted bitter, but they were true. I thought efficiency mattered more than experience. That cutting costs was the only way to move forward. But I was wrong. Daniel said nothing. Mark exhaled, forcing himself to continue. The customers left. The mechanics quit. We lost every major account. We're bleeding money. He sighed, shaking his head. I don't know how to fix it. A flicker of something crossed Daniel's face. Amusement? Pity? He let out a slow breath, tilting his head slightly. So, what now? Mark reached into his jacket, pulled out a folder, and held it out. I need you to come back. But not as a mechanic. Daniel didn't take the folder. He simply stared at it. Mark pressed on. I'm offering you full control over operations. Quality assurance, hiring, training, everything. You run the shop your way. Daniel didn't move. Mark's grip on the folder tightened, his voice quieter now, almost strained. I need you, Daniel. For the first time, something in Daniel's expression shifted, a flicker of emotion, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Then he took the folder, opening it. He scanned the pages. The offer was valid, more than valid. It was generous. A stake in ownership, decision-making authority, everything he had ever wanted to protect the integrity of the shop. He let out a quiet breath, then closed the folder, tapping it against his palm. I'll think about it. Mark's shoulders dropped slightly in relief. That's all I can ask. Daniel gave a small nod. Then, after a pause, he spoke again. You should talk to your father. Mark stiffened. Daniel held his gaze. You think you're fixing the business, but you're really trying to prove something to him. You always have. Mark clenched his jaw. It's not. He stopped himself, took a breath, shook his head. This isn't about him. Daniel's lips curled slightly, almost in a smirk. If you say so. Mark didn't argue. Instead, he nodded once, turned, and walked back toward his car. As he reached the driver's side door, he hesitated, then without looking back, he spoke. I hope you say yes. Daniel watched as the Bentley rolled out of the lot, disappearing down the street. He looked back at the folder in his hand, and for the first time in weeks, he truly considered what it would mean to return. 2 days passed before Daniel made his decision. He had spent the better part of the last 30 years at Rockwell Motors, and walking away had felt like cutting off a limb. But returning, that was something else entirely. He had built a new rhythm at Elite Auto, found a place where his experience was valued, where he wasn't seen as an old relic. But Rockwell Motors wasn't just another shop. It had been his home. And despite everything, a part of him still cared about what happened to it. So when he pulled up in front of the shop that morning, he didn't hesitate. He stepped out of his truck, toolbox in hand, and walked through the familiar garage doors. Inside, the place was barely holding together. Mechanics were scrambling to keep up with a backlog of work. The front desk was flooded with paperwork. A frustrated customer was at the counter, arguing with the receptionist about a botched repair. The tension was thick, the kind of pressure that signaled a business on the verge of collapse. Mark was in his office, looking over numbers that wouldn't save him. He didn't notice Daniel until the door opened, and by then, Daniel was already standing in front of his desk, setting down the folder, the one with the agreement Mark had given him. I have conditions, Daniel said. Mark looked up, startled, then nodded quickly. Of course. Anything. Daniel pulled up a chair and sat down. First, I'm rehiring Luis and everyone else who left because of your decisions. Second, we're bringing back full quality control. No more cutting corners. No more rush repairs. If you want Rockwell Motors to survive, it needs to be about trust again, not speed. Mark swallowed hard, nodding. Done. Daniel leaned forward slightly. And last, you don't question me when it comes to the shop floor. You wanted efficiency? What I build here will be efficient, but not at the cost of safety, reputation, or the people working under this roof. Mark held his gaze for a long moment, then exhaled, nodding again. Okay. Daniel studied him, looking for hesitation, for ego. He didn't see any, just exhaustion. A man who had run out of ways to fight the inevitable. Okay, Daniel said, standing up. Then let's get to work. That afternoon, Rockwell Motors began to change. Word spread quickly, first through the mechanics, then to the customers who had turned their backs on the shop. Within days, people started coming back. The auto club, the classic car owners, even Mrs. Fletcher, who had sworn she'd never set foot in the place again. Daniel worked tirelessly, bringing order to the chaos. He retrained the younger mechanics, showing them the things that couldn't be taught in manuals: how to listen for the difference in an engine's idle, how to feel when a belt was a millimeter too loose, how to recognize when a repair wasn't just good enough but perfect. Luis returned the same day, shaking his head at Mark but offering Daniel a firm handshake. One by one, the others followed. Some had taken jobs elsewhere, but for those who had stayed in town, coming back wasn't even a question. The repairs were precise again. The complaints stopped. And Rockwell Motors, for the first time since Mark had taken over, began to resemble the shop it had once been. One evening, long after the last customer had left, Mark found Daniel in the garage, leaning over the hood of an old Camaro, checking the final touches on a restoration project. Mark cleared his throat. The books are looking better. We're still recovering, but if this keeps up, we'll be back in the green soon. Daniel nodded but didn't look up. Good. Mark hesitated, then leaned against the workbench beside him. You were right, he admitted. About everything. I thought I was running a business, but I was tearing it apart. Daniel straightened, closing the hood with a firm click. Your father understood something you didn't. Mark sighed. Yeah. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, then met his gaze. You can't run a place like this from behind a desk. You have to be in it. Listen to the machines. Know your people. He tossed the rag onto the bench. You thought trust was automatic. It's not. It's earned. And when you break it, it's damn hard to get back. Mark swallowed, nodding slowly. I get that now. A long silence stretched between them, but for the first time, it wasn't uncomfortable. Daniel smirked. Good. Then stop standing around. We've got work to do. Mark let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Yeah, we do. And just like that, Rockwell Motors wasn't just a shop again. It was a family. In today's fast-paced world, businesses often prioritize speed and profits over quality and trust. The story of Daniel Carter isn't just about a mechanic, it's about a timeless truth. Experience and integrity can never be replaced by shortcuts. We've seen it happen everywhere. Businesses shedding seasoned workers for younger, cheaper labor, only to realize too late that expertise and skill aren't just line items on a spreadsheet. For those of us who've spent decades honing our craft, this story is a reminder: you're not replaceable. Whether you're a tradesman, a business owner, or a professional of any kind, your experience carries a value that no algorithm or efficiency metric can reflect. And for those making decisions at the top, remember this: the strength of any business, any team, any legacy, is built on trust, not just numbers. So ask yourself, are you building something that lasts, or are you chasing short-term gains? The answer will determine whether your success is temporary or timeless. If this story resonated with you, don't just leave it here. Subscribe now to QH Incredible Stories, where real insights meet powerful storytelling. Hit that button because the best stories, they're the ones that make us rethink, relearn, and rebuild. Stay incredible.